first episode of Postcards and Podcasts. I'm Thomas Mallitte, and today we will be discussing the history of Pembroke Castle with Howard Rudge. Howard Rudge, you're the chairman of Pembroke Town Walls Trust and a guide at Pembroke Castle. Please could you discuss why you came down to Pembroke and what set you off on this path towards learning a little bit more about history?
Well, hello, Thomas. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me to come and do your first podcast. I think it's a very exciting opportunity for everybody here in Tanyard. My history goes a long way because I'm an old man. But what I can tell you is, first of all, in coming down to Pembroke, my wife and I were fortunate to retire quite a long time ago. And we've been coming down to Pembroke to visit our friends who own a hotel down here for many years, and we fell in love with the place, and we both said to each other, when we do finally retire, it's going to be down to Pembroke.
Okay.
And we came down here 6 years ago and love it. We absolutely love the place. My home base is Lancashire, and we came down from Lancashire to enjoy ourselves in Pembroke. And when I came to Pembroke, I discovered, in fact, that there is so much history here as well as great beauty that it was a perfect place for me, particularly.
Okay.
Being an amateur historian.
And what made you an amateur historian then?
Yeah, so that's a long story as well. This goes back to when I was 8 years of age. I remember, sitting down one day, it was Sunday lunch, and my brother, sister and I were sat there with my mother and father. My father suddenly pipes up and he said, I'm going to start going out visiting old houses and churches and monasteries, and I'd like some company. Anybody want to come and join me? Well, my brother, my sister, my mother were not interested in history, but I was, vaguely. But I thought this is a good opportunity to get out with my dad. Mm-hmm. And so my father and I started going out visiting these amazing places long before they were open to the general public. My dad was quite good. What he would do is he'd go and knock on the door of an old house and say, we'd love to come and have a look round. My boy is really very interested in what you've got to offer. Yes. Yeah. And that was the lever. We didn't get in everyone, but we got in enough to make it very interesting. Mm-hmm. And that was the birth of my love of history. And then, of course, when I went to grammar school and studied history for a couple of years, I realised that from a long-term career point of view, it wasn't going to be history. I don't know why I thought that, but I realised it was. So I didn't take history any further, although I was good at it at school, because I'm one of those people. I just read it. I've learned it.
Right.
Yeah. Not the same for mathematics, unfortunately. No. But anyway, I did, in fact, give up history then. But when we finally retired, was determined that one of my hobbies in retirement would be history. And the way I achieved that was simple. I set up a tour guiding company in my home county of Lancashire, in northwest Lancashire. And we used to take coaches out, we would sit in the seat next to the driver, the low one on the front of the left of the coach. And we would take this captive audience all around North Lancashire and regale them with all our stories of history and lots of fun for about 5 to 5.5 hours.
Well, so, and your tours at Pembroke Castle, they last an hour and a half.
They do, right? Yes.
Child's play.
By comparison, easy. Yes. It does train you to talk for a long time with ease and pace yourself and balance your stories. It was really good training for being a guide. And I was doing all kinds of work up in Lancashire in that respect. And then when we came down here 6 years ago, I got the job at Pembroke Castle. Loved it. I'm still there today. And the tours are proving successful. Very successful.
So you came down because you loved it.
Yes.
And that's the thing about tourists coming down to Pembrokeshire, and even locals. They believe that Pembrokeshire is this sort of idyllic place in the far west of Wales. And I suppose very much like many other places, but I imagine you can tell me some particular stories. Pembroke actually had quite a grisly past, and Pembroke Castle being a medieval castle probably had some of the grisliest of stories. And I was wondering if you might be able to enlighten some of us about that.
Certainly. Because, of course, Pembroke Castle was a frontier castle, very much.
Sure.
It was in the Wild West. Mm-hmm. And it was the bridgehead between England, Wales and Ireland, of course. So it acted as the setting off point if you're going to Ireland from England and Wales. It was also the return point, likewise coming back. But it also represented a defensive position at what was usually regarded as the soft underbelly of England and Wales for invasion, rather than coming up perhaps the well-defended south coast, coming through Wales quietly. through the back door and come and surprise everybody through this soft underbelly. So it was a strategically very, very important castle. And of course, it was built in 1093 in the first instance with a wooden castle.
By Arnulf.
Yeah, Roger de Montgomery and his son Arnulf.
And that was it, yes.
He was the great Earl of Shrewsbury. And then, of course, the stone castle was developed on top of on the original site of the wooden one, and then extended to the castle that we see today. Mm-hmm. Now, I've got stories that bridge some of that time. I've got stories going back, obviously, to 1093 or even earlier, because I'll just throw in for future reference that Pembroke has nearly 12,000 years of history. But we'll come back to that on a later podcast. The current history, nearly 1,000 years old, starts when the Normans arrive. I shall going to tell you one story, or perhaps several stories about that period at the end of this podcast, but I'm going to start, in fact, in the middle period, the middle medieval period, in the year 1440.
Sure.
Now, in 1440, the castle was not then currently garrisoned. The Earls of Pembroke weren't using it actively at that time, although it was to be re-garrisoned later. My story involves two men. One is Humphrey, the Duke of Gloucester, the brother to the King of England, Henry VI of England, and a man called John Whithorn. Now, John was a rich landowner based out of the Isle of Wight, but he owned property in the Isle of Wight and southern England. And we know that Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, was planning treason against his brother. In other words, he wanted the throne for himself. And one of the ways he could achieve that was to buy land, because land meant money. It also gave you people to recruit for your army. And he was voraciously swallowing up a lot of land, spending his gold. And in the year 1440, he goes to see John Whithorn on the Isle of Wight.
Yes.
And so he sits down with John and his family, and he offers a huge amount of gold to buy John Whithorn's land, because he was very rich in land. And John Whithorn said, "No, I'm not going to sell you my land," which is rather unusual, because he was talking to the brother of the king, the second most important man in the land. But John Whithorn was surprisingly determined in saying no.
What was that?
The Duke was furious. Well, he was stubborn. He was a very stubborn man, but also he was a clever man, and he knew what the Duke was doing. And obviously his loyalties, John's loyalties, were to Henry VI, not to his brother. So there was politics involved.
As they should be,
as they
I
should
imagine,
be,
at the time.
And so the Duke ups his offer, and eventually the Duke goes away absolutely furious, because John Whithorn has just said no to him. So he's scheming and plotting and planning. And a few months later, he briefs his troops, his key crack troops, and he says, "I want you to go back to John Whithorn's farmhouse, and what I want you to do is to make him disappear. Kidnap him, not kill him, kidnap him, but in such a way that no one sees the act. It's very important. I understand that." And so they do. They did indeed travel down. They did indeed kidnap Whithorn, presumably sometime at night. And then they brought him back to Pembroke Castle, because the Duke was also the Earl of Pembroke, and he had the castle, but it was empty. However, of course, we've got a dungeon and a prison and a few other things besides, and the Duke had the troops incarcerate John Whithorn in our little dungeon.
How little?
Well, let me explain. It's a small round tower, and the dungeon was the bottom's face, 15 feet, 5 metres deep, down to the earth floor below, but not very wide, a very small round turret. Really not much room at all. And it's properly described as an oubliette. The French verb oublier, which means to forget, became attached to a person who might be thrown in such a dungeon.
Very sad connotations.
Very sad connotation. Oubliette meaning the forgotten, the place of the forgotten. And that's what happened. John Whithorn was incarcerated in the dungeon of Pembroke Castle. Now, nobody knows where he is, but the Duke is very clever. He waits for several more months, and then he turns back to the family and comes in and says, "I wish to see John Whithorn, please. Again, I've come to make an improved offer for his land." And the family say, "Sir, we're very sorry. He's disappeared. He must be dead. He must have gone over the cliff, or he's been captured by bandits, because there were plenty of bandits about still then. Maybe they've killed him and buried somewhere, but he's certainly missing. He's been missing for 6 months. He's dead." And the Duke says, "Oh, I'm really sorry to hear that." And he offers them more gold, and the family accept it. They sell the land to the Duke, who's triumphant.
Yes.
However, he has ordered that John Whithorn be kept alive, because, again, politics are behind that. And so he's there with 2 prison guards, and as far as we know, no one else. And the 2 prison guards were charged with keeping this man alive, but secretly. Yeah.
Okay.
Not to make they weren't to go out into the town or anything like that. Food was delivered into them, and they just kept very quiet about it. So let me describe the cellar to you, because it is a cellar. It's a cellar, really. It's, I say, 5 meters, 15 feet deep. The floor is made of beaten earth. It's covered in damp straw. There are rats and mice running about, and the straw is infested with lice.
Really left to
It's
rot.
really horrible. And he was chained to the wall. He wouldn't have a bed or a chair. He would simply sleep in the chains against the back wall. He was fed food, we think, about twice a day, and he was not talked to. He wasn't allowed to talk to anybody. Let me describe the dungeon further. It's dark. There's only a very tiny amount of light in there, so you wouldn't really know properly whether it's day or night. There'd be no one to talk to. You're chained to the wall. There's nothing to do. The prison guards won't talk to you except to give specific commands or requests. And it's a hellhole. That's the best way I can describe it. And John Whithorn survived down there in the rats and the mice and the lice with no toilet to visit. So I'll leave the rest to your imagination on that one. And he managed to survive for 7 long years.
Well,
Now,
good
I would
on him.
ask your listeners, can you imagine surviving down there any longer than just a few months? I don't think so.
No.
You go mad, or you die, or you go mad and then die. But you wouldn't last for 7 years. Anyway, coming back to the story. What happens then is the Duke leaves...
Very stubborn then.
Yeah, a very stubborn man. The Duke leaves him down there, and the Duke continues his programme of land buying. One day, 7 years later, some friend John Whithorn, still thinking he might be alive, heard a story of a prisoner, or possibly a prisoner, held in the empty Pembroke Castle. So they come, and sure enough, they find to their amazement that John Whithorn is still alive. And they rescue him, they take the prison guards into custody, and they take John back to his family, into the care of his family, because when they found him, the poor man was crippled, diseased, and blind.
A King Lear sort of level of tragedy there going on.
Indeed, there's a King Lear level tragedy, and of course it's also very similar, but this is a real story compared to the Man in the Iron Mask. Or similar.
Mm-hmm.
The Count of Monte Cristo comes to mind.
Yes.
And so John Whithorn is rescued, he's with his family, he's survived. The next part of the story is that these good people go to see the king directly. Now, King Henry VI was a weak king. Yeah, he wasn't decisive, and he knew his brother was committing treason or planning to commit treason, and he was reluctant to do anything about it. He didn't take the strong-handed actions that other kings might well have done. But when he hears the story of the kidnapper John Whithorn, it's rather like the straw that broke the camel's back, inasmuch as it was the last straw. Indeed it was. He was furious. And so John Whithorn is going to get his revenge, because the Duke is put on trial, he's found guilty. But before he could be put to death nastily, whether he would have been hung, drawn or quartered, we're not quite sure, but it would have been a very nasty end. He committed suicide with poison.
Right.
And the good news was that it would appear that the king returned the land to his family and John without charge.
Well...
So what we now understand fully is that John Whithorn was a strong-minded man. Remember, I said he was very determined not to sell his land in the first instance. Well, he carried that same strong will, strong mind, determination with him into that dungeon. And I'm quite certain that that's what kept him alive. It was a determination to obviously get his revenge on the Duke, because he knew it was the Duke's man who had kidnapped him, and also to see his family again. And his determination carried him through the ordeal.
And that was in Pembroke Castle?
That was all in Pembroke Castle.
Well, there we are.
Just on the doorstep from here.
Brilliant. So, Howard, the dungeon sounds very small. You said, what, 15 feet, was it? 15
feet deep, and it's just a few feet deep. Wide, yeah.
Were there not places for other men?
Yes, indeed.
A larger prison?
There was a larger prison, and it's only recently been confirmed that it was indeed a prison. In one of the towers, called Monkton Tower, we are now confident that prisoners were held in that tower. The background to this
is incredibly old, isn't it?
Well, that's over 700 years old.
So,
yes.
okay.
The dungeon tower, it goes back at least 810 years,
Okay,
possibly slightly earlier. But the prison tower was there because Pembroke Castle was effectively the county hall of Pembrokeshire. Yeah.
Okay.
And they used to hold all the courts there, of which there were 5 different kinds of court. The administrators for the county, the tax collectors, and the sheriff, the lawman with his team. Yeah, they were all living there. And, of course, they were bringing in prisoners on a regular basis. Now, these people would be townsfolk, peasants, and they could be caught for anything. They could be brought to justice for anything. Stealing an apple, rather than just get a clip round the ear, they'd very often be brought in to be tried. And small and large crimes alike were pretty heavily handed by the sheriff. And
they weren't put in prison for 7 years.
No, they weren't put in prison for 7 years, but it was a rough deal because what would happen is the courts were spread throughout the year, so you'd have time gaps between each of the court sessions. Now, what would happen is the prisoners would be brought in. They were brought in from the street, the field, or wherever they were arrested by the sheriff's man. They'd be given a brief hearing by somebody like the sheriff or the constable of the castle, and then they would be held in jail pending the next court hearing.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, I'm not saying that some of the very minor offences might well be dealt with by the sheriff or the constable, but in the main, most people, men, women and children, would be brought in and imprisoned.
Women and children.
Women and children as well. And they would be arrested. They would have manacles put on their wrists, and then they'd be taken over to the Monkton Tower, and there would be a ring bolt, no longer there, but a ring bolt in the centre of the floor. They would be sat down with their backs against the wall and a chain linked from their manacle to the ring bolt in the floor.
Yes.
Now that way, because it's a large tower, the prison tower room, which is a circular room, means you could easily get 25 people or more sat with their backs against the wall, sleeping like that, chained to the central ring bolt.
Would there have been, I imagine, 25, if 25 people could easily sort of sit there, was it squalid? Was it a squalid sort of condition? There would have been more than 25. It wouldn't have been so lovingly sort of distributed.
Indeed. I described the filth of the dungeon tower, where you can translate that directly across to the prison tower.
Okay.
Because two would have been a beaten earth floor. It was a beaten earth floor and still is a beaten earth floor. And they'd have had some straw on it, but again, you've got the rats and the mice and no regular visits to the toilet, I'm afraid. So the stink would be atrocious. The conditions are cramped. There's no way to sleep properly. And they could be held like that for up to probably 2 months, awaiting trial. If they were lucky, your trial was within a few days.
Okay.
So they would be arrested, imprisoned, and then they'd be taken to the court hearings in the chancery in the castle. And depending upon the crime, would be their sentence. Now, an awful lot of crimes we wouldn't consider that major today were indeed punishable by hanging, by death.
Is there a particular sort of trivial
yes, I think
if
you thought stealing an apple, or you swore at somebody important, or really minor crimes that, I won't go on because there's a long list.
Okay.
Then the chances are you get a clip round the ear, or you might, well, of course, be put into the stocks in the marketplace where people will throw rotten fruit at you.
Mm-hmm.
Minor things, yes. But for more serious crimes, theft on a proper scale, if you stole an animal, for example, somebody's animal, or you stole supplies of food on a big scale, I'm afraid you were facing a hanging.
Oh.
And so they'd be taken down to the castle if they were sentenced to death, and they so often were, taken down the hill to the base to the bottom of Westgate, where it joins Northgate and Main Street. That was the early medieval marketplace, and they would have been hung in public there in the marketplace.
For all to see.
For all to see. Yeah. So the conditions in which they were held were squalid. Death perhaps was almost a release. So it wasn't for long term, because right through from the Norman and medieval periods, justice was fairly summary. It was done with fairly quickly.
Sure.
Imprisonment as a punishment really didn't exist.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that was usually reserved for very important people like kings and princes and dukes and earls who've committed crimes. They could be held under either house arrest or in somewhere like what became famous, the Tower of London, although the Tower of London initially was always a royal palace first, although it had prison cells.
People weren't killed in the dungeon itself then? They were killed outside of the castle?
They were taken out to be punished.
Okay. Because
whether it was stocks or other crimes, which I'll tell you about one or two of the nasty ones in a little while.
Yeah.
Back to those for a moment. What I also discovered was that it wasn't uncommon for people to be given some form of chastisement or indeed torture in the very cell in front of the other prisoners. Quite often they might be whipped. They might have their... Now, we think that waterboarding is a modern punishment, get people underwater. In fact, it wasn't. It was conducted in the medieval period. Yeah.
Right.
And it was happening in the time of the witches' trials, waterboarding. So we know it's an old punishment, and it wouldn't be too difficult to treat people to waterboarding. More likely what they would do is they'd have a large bowl of water, and they'd stick their heads in and hold them under. I think that was the popular way of doing it. And they'd be punishing for the other people. Of course, they were putting the fear of God into the minds of all the other prisoners. Particularly if any were hanging out claiming their innocence. They might be next for torture.
And this was the 1400s, similar sort of time?
We're talking through the 13 and 1400s.
This is sort of Catholic. Were they Catholics?
They were then. Everybody was still under the auspices of the Church of Rome. Indeed, they were.
So we've got sort of almost Spanish Inquisition-esque.
Not that brutal, I'm afraid.
Not that brutal. No.
Not as gory as
Oh, what
that.
a shame.
But by today's modern standards,
yes,
hugely horrific.
I imagine.
Nevertheless, it was squalid, it was filthy, they were ill-treated, and I'm quite certain, although I've no record of this, unfortunately, in the castle's archives, I'm quite certain a number of them would have died in that jail.
Oh.
Of terror, fear, of deprivation. Some of them might suffer also, as was quite common, they would simply go mad. They would simply lose their minds. In the constant state of fear and filth, it would be atrocious. That's what makes the story earlier of John Whithorn so remarkable, that he was able to have that strength of mind to survive against all the odds. The terminal end for most people being hung was, as I say, not unusual for minor crimes. But really the punishment, I think, lay in the prison conditions. They were suffering even before they were found guilty, which is a dreadful state to be in. And I'll just mention one or two things, because of course Pembroke is one of the most haunted castles in
Yes, and I know you hold
Wales.
you
I happen to be the ghost tour guide.
Yes.
And I've got a couple of stories about the prison tower whilst we're on it, and that is that a gentleman many years ago was in the castle. He was a relatively young man in his 30s. He was a keen photographer, walking around with his camera, taking a lot of photographs, and he happened to walk into the prison tower, the Monkton Tower, and he found there a young lady, a girl of about 12 or 13, he said, sat against the wall with her elbows on her knees, and her shoulders were heaving as she was sobbing. So thinking, what's on earth's the matter? He rushed over to help her, and as he put his hands down to hold her, she disappeared in front of his eyes.
Wow, okay.
And he wasn't scared. Many people are frightened, but he wasn't scared. And indeed, he made a note in his records that he was just disappointed he didn't think to get a photograph first.
Which I suppose, if you believe in that sort of thing, that's a testament to the fact that they would have kept it. It didn't matter how old you were.
No.
You would be punished.
Men, women and children could be punished, could be held in prison. And in future podcasts, we can come back to that, because there are many stories attached to that. So how do we know it's a prison? Well, we're quite confident, because when you go up the steps and along the wall to walk into the tower, as you go into the corridor, the narrow corridor that leads into the tower, on the right-hand side, there is clearly what is a guard's room. Yeah,
okay.
Because, in fact, in the plasterwork on the walls of that guard room, bored guards 700 years ago sat there probably playing games to entertain themselves. were taking their knives out and scratching graffiti into the plaster, but coats of arms and names, and that. And in fact, they're so precious, of such national importance, that we have them now protected behind
Listed,
glass in the guardroom. Yeah. And on the opposite side is the toilet for the guards, which is one of the 15 toilets on the walls of the castle. But the prisoners wouldn't be given access to the toilet.
No, of course not.
No.
Almost...
Yeah, it was a dreadful place. And the other thing we know is that the space above it, the room above it, is in fact different from all the other rooms in the castle, because it's clearly got purpose-built accommodation into the tower. People lived in the towers, but we think it was possibly for the prisoner, the prison... the gaoler, or it might have even been the sheriff's abode, the sheriff, the lawman. It could have been it, because it's quite pleasant, because you've actually got quite clearly a sitting room, if you like, and a bedroom.
Okay.
All right.
Oh, yeah,
and so clear. It was clearly for somebody of significance. And that's linked with the prison itself is an awful place, because it's a large round dark tower, but the walls of that Monkton Tower are hugely thick, very little light, dark and dismal, and clearly a place to threaten, to discourage people from punishment.
Wow.
Dreadful place.
Dreadful place. Howard, in regards to the dungeon tower, you said that there might be 25 or more people chained together at one time. And would they have known each other? Would they have been able to communicate with each other? Because, of course, I imagine they would have spoken Norman French, but would they have spoken Welsh?
Okay.
This being Wales.
That's a short question, and I've got a long answer.
Okay, great.
Okay. Let's go back to the Normans first. The Normans invaded Wales in 1093. In numbers, they were already in Wales, but they invaded in numbers and built Pembroke Castle, a wooden castle initially. Mm-hmm. Now, they were, of course, speaking their own Norman French, which was heavily different from French, because, you see, they were the descendants of Vikings who settled in northern France. They were called the Men from the North, or the Northmen, which became abbreviated to Norman. And the King of France in the year 911 gave the land that we call today Normandy to these Vikings. So the Normans had invaded, were only fourth generation Normans.
Sure, okay.
And their language would have been a combination of Scandinavian language, or Germanic language, and French of the period. True French of the period. So it wasn't a true French.
Okay.
And when they settled, they brought over people from Flanders, the Flemish people, who were speaking a similar language, so they would be able to communicate with each other. But what they also did was bring people, we could call them economic migrants, from Devon and Cornwall, because the Devonians, the Cornish people, they owed no allegiance to the throne of England.
No.
Bearing in mind they were Celtic peoples. When the Romans came, the Celtic peoples who wouldn't stay in England moved themselves into Wales, Cornwall and Devon, Ireland, and even southern Scotland.
And them being Celtic, that doesn't necessarily mean that they had an allegiance to the Welsh Celts.
Not necessarily, no, they were just Celts.
They were just Celts.
But they didn't have any allegiance to the Welsh Celts. No, they didn't. They had no allegiance to anybody. Mm-hmm. They were a small independent state, all in all but name. And so they came over and they worked for the Normans. And by the way, just as a little aside, they've done DNA testing in southern Pembrokeshire, and there are clear, distinct DNA links from the people of today right back to those Celtic peoples who came across as economic migrants from Cornwall and Devon.
There we are.
So
our heritage, our future.
Already you've got a mixture of languages. Mm-hmm. Now, as we come through to the period when the prison was built, which is about 725 years ago, we've moved on for a couple of hundred years. What you get in the land then is a mixture of French in general terms, but by now the Normans have, of course, been intermarrying the Anglo-Saxon peoples of England, whom they displaced in effect, or they didn't displace them, but they controlled and subjugated the Anglo-Saxons. And just as a small point of interest, Anglo-Saxon
transplanted, perhaps.
Sorry,
transplanted might be a better.
Indeed, yeah. But the Anglo-Saxons spoke a language which is actually the core of our English today. I'll give you an example of just one word. Okay. The word in Anglo-Saxon for England was Englander.
Okay.
So you had Norman French, you had Anglo-Saxon languages, merging in the main. These are the two core languages merging. And as the centuries bypassed, that developed into the English that we have today, where the Anglo-Saxon predominated more over the French side and became our English of today. The Welsh Celtic peoples, of course, retained their own language, as did the Cornish and the Devonians and people in Ireland and Scotland. So we've got a breed of people now, 700 years ago, who are speaking a franglais, some Anglo-Saxons, a patois, a language we certainly won't understand.
Yes,
but in general terms, they would understand each other, whether they originated from Normandy or Flanders or Cornwall or Devon. It had become one huge melting pot of language. And of course, you also have the Danish language thrown in as well, but that's a long story, so I won't go any more about that.
And they, I imagine, with the extremity of the punishments, they didn't live harmoniously.
I think they did.
They did.
My understanding is that they did live here.
Okay.
I mean, in southern Pembrokeshire, we must remember that what in fact we have is a melting pot originally of peoples. Yes. But the people that were excluded from southern Pembrokeshire were the Celtic Welsh.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, because they had their own language, and they were banished to the northern half of Pembrokeshire by the Normans.
Which is why Pembrokeshire now, it's not quite nom de plume, but Pembrokeshire is now known as the Little England beyond Wales. Correct. And this is the origin of that.
This is the origin. We're right back at the origin of that now. And so these people in the jail would have had the ability they would have had a common language, for the want of a better word. Yes, they'd have understood each other quite well.
Returning to this idea of sort of grisly crime or grisly punishment, what sort of punishments were dealt out by the Normans?
Well, I hope you've got a strong stomach. That's all I can say. Yeah.
Lovely.
The people they would have under their control would be, again, these Flemish peoples and the Devonians and the Cornish people. Mm-hmm. And I've no doubt if there were any Welsh people who had decided to join rather than fight the Normans, they may well have been involved as well. But it's not clear from the records I have. Oh. But the kind of punishments that were the normal for the Normans hand out, irrespective of who they were punishing, because it was just the crime, not the individual they were punishing, if you like, that would be fairly brutal. I'll give you some examples. But little children, young children, well, let's say 10, 11, if they were caught stealing an apple in the marketplace by a Norman soldier, he would bring them in for punishment. Now, that would be summary punishment. What they would do is, in the extreme...
Summary meaning?
Summary should be there and then.
Okay, sure.
Not being put into prison waiting trial. It's just punishment immediate. Is meted out immediately. Summary punishment. And they were set up in the marketplace, in public, a pan of boiling water into which they poured a red dye. And then they would plunge the child's hand into the boiling water with the red dye. The boiling water would remove the skin and the red dye would soak into the flesh.
Oh my God.
And that gave rise to the saying, caught red-handed.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Okay.
Oh, I mean, only not okay for wow.
I won't give all the range of punishments because it would take too long.
Sure.
But picking out the best of them, I would certainly refer to
the worst.
Someone who was caught telling a lie. They're accused of lying, particularly if it involved the Normans themselves, the ruling class, or even perhaps the Earl or someone senior within the community.
Lying to them?
Lying about them.
About them.
Lying about them.
Slander.
Libel. Yes. If they were caught lying in that way, then quite typically they would cut that person's tongue out.
And that would put a stop to that.
To add even more to that, if they said, and what is more, you were spreading this lie quite deliberately, you were truly out to create a situation where scandal might come to this person, then they would also cut your ears off.
Why?
Because it was an indication that you've been passing the message on, and obviously people had been listening to that, and so the crime suited the style of punishment.
Yes. You obviously don't appreciate ears.
Yes.
Filling them with that rubbish.
That's right.
So we'll chop yours off.
So now you've got someone who might be walking around with a red hand, with no tongue
No ears.
and no ears.
Oh no.
If an adult was caught stealing, and it was a minor theft, like I say, coming back to the famous apples in the marketplace, and people were often severely punished for doing just that, you would find an adult would again receive summary punishment, and they simply put his hand on a block and chop his hand off.
Which is happening to this day, isn't it? Just these few days ago in Brunei, they've introduced Sharia law, which is basically
Exactly
it's,
that,
it's old religion, isn't it?
It is.
So they're chopping off people's hands, and if you think that's bad, it's still happening today.
Yeah, I'll tell you a little story if I may.
Okay.
Going back, in my youth, I spent some time working in the Persian Gulf, as it was called then. But on the Arabian side of the Persian Gulf.
Right.
And I was doing junior menial jobs, which included security, watching people as goods were being transferred and moved about. And I caught one man stealing boxes of pills, medicines that were being imported.
Which would have been very expensive at the time.
Arabia, which would have been very expensive, yes. And the authorities took him away, and I thought no more of it. Except a week later, I heard that he had had his hand chopped off for that crime which I had reported. So I sent that man to prison to have his hand chopped off, which lived with me for quite a long time. Yeah. Horrible thing to do.
Yes.
Disgusting thing to do. But there you have it. And as you rightly say, it's still going on. Coming back to the nasty Normans, however.
Yes.
So we've got tongues missing.
We have
ears missing. Hands missing.
Justice missing.
Yeah.
All kinds of things.
If they wanted to give you a more severe form of punishment, just for the sake of it, not because it was necessarily your crime deserved such a level of punishment, it wasn't uncommon to have your eyes gouged out.
Oh.
Yeah. All gruesome stuff.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
Oh.
So, as you can see, the style of punishment, this summary judgment, as it's called, was brutal and cruel in the extreme.
And that would have been summary, even the blinding, they would have just gone, you've done this, just
yes. Oh, yes. Yeah.
chop.
Yeah. There was no, this is right in the early days of the Norman period. You see, there was no court structure, there were no prisons, nothing. It was just whoever was doing it could probably get away with it. Perhaps a junior soldier couldn't do it, but a sergeant at arms or a knight could easily commit such a heinous, what I would call, crime against humanity by
I would
putting
too.
people to these brutal punishments. Yeah, and of course, ultimately, a death was one as well. So they wouldn't hang them, they'd usually just chop their heads off, because that was far quicker and easier to do on the spur of the moment.
Probably much more spectacular as well.
Yeah. So you can see that the Normans were cruel and vicious. They were in the extreme. It was a dreadful thing. And they brought that when they invaded England initially in 1066. And they suppressed the 2.25 million Anglo-Saxons just using 30,000 Norman soldiers. It's an amazing feat. I mean, they were brilliant soldiers and tacticians. But the North rose up against them, the North of England rose up against them, and they famously called the harrying of the North, which doesn't sound too much, but it was involved brutally slaying tens of thousands of people and burning everything. And I mean everything. They destroyed the North of England.
Razed it.
Yeah, they razed it to the ground, literally.
Yes.
And that, of course, was a terrifying example for the fate which might lie for others if they got up and revolted against the Normans. So that made it easy for them then just to pick off individuals with brutal treatment, put literally the fear of God, if I can use that expression, into people. And that's the way, with clever soldiery, brilliant soldiery, they controlled a much larger enemy, the 2.25 million Anglo-Saxons.
I want to say well done.
That's not possible, is it? No, it just isn't possible.
Brilliant.
It's just a brutal truth how good they were at achieving their objectives.
Thank you, Howard.
And people say they would want to live in the good old days.
Yes. Oh, Howard. On another matter, whilst doing my research, I came across lots of earls lots of earls of Pembroke Castle, and there was a first earl, and then there was a second earl, and then there was a third earl, and then there was a first earl, and then there was another first earl later on, later along the line, and this confused me somewhat. Would you be able to?
It confuses most people.
Oh, does it?
You're okay. Everybody gets
Great.
confused with this. Yeah. Just to give you a broad example that explains it simply.
Okay.
Obviously, there was a very first Earl of Pembroke.
Sure.
Yeah, once the Normans settled here, there was a first Earl. And then there was in the same family, his son, and then his son. So you got 1, 2, 3. But then, back then particularly, the further back you go in history, the more this happens. The king fell out with the third Earl, and so booted him out and appointed a new Earl from a different family.
Sure.
So he became the first Earl of the second.
What qualifying attributes would the new first Earl have to be the
good pal of the
first
king?
Earl of, what's that?
A good pal of the king. Yeah, somebody he liked.
Okay.
Yeah, and who knew could do the job. There were. He wouldn't just appoint somebody who was his friend. He knew that when he was appointing a man to Pembroke, he was appointing to a man who had to make independent decisions because they're so far removed from the centre of power.
Yes,
250
as we are now,
which was like beyond the moon in those days.
Yes,
that this Earl had to be capable of judgment. He had to be capable of understanding where he was. He understood how defence was important.
Because you were saying earlier that this was a
frontier. It's a frontier.
Exactly, it's a frontier and a prime strategic position. You had Ireland.
Yeah, one of the most important strategic places in the land. In fact.
Well, in fact, there's even today there's a naval base that was called the Stronghold in the West, and it's because this particular position is so vital to military politics.
Indeed.
Even now.
Yeah, absolutely. It still is, without a doubt. Yeah. And so he had to appoint a good man, a man he knew had the strength, the understanding, the intelligence to be capable of independent decision-making and would be a good stronghold against any potential invasion. And so...
And then I imagine they would carry on the line?
They would carry on the line, and at some point, remember, it usually passed down through the male heirs, albeit, let me stress, this is another day, but women in the medieval period were, in their own right, equal to men in the sense that they could own property. It might be a small farmhouse, it might be a manor, it might be an estate, it might be a castle. Earls, countesses had very much the same authority and power as any man.
Well, the word man itself literally means its immediate origins or its initial origins are literally mean person.
Person.
And it was the attachment of weir onto which was wife, which then became woman. But there was this idea that male or female, you would be a person.
Yeah.
Okay.
But what would happen is the king again, if that man was to say commit treason against the king, if he changed his allegiances, then the king's going to get rid of him, and he appoints another family.
The first Earl.
Yeah. They called them the creations.
The creations.
Yeah. Okay. So you get the first, second, third Earl gone. Next new Earl. So that's the first creation. Is the first Earl of the first creation, the second Earl of the first creation, the third Earl of the first creation.
Okay.
Now the next one's the first Earl of the second creation. Yeah, I won't go on.
I see.
You get the picture. And that's why you get so many different creations of the earldom of Pembroke, as you would anywhere else indeed, or indeed dukedoms.
One of the things that with postcards and podcasts is, one of the key things, is that we wish to encourage young people to foster a greater affection for history and to consider their own heritage to be something of greater value to them, and perhaps they could learn more about it. So with that idea in mind, who was the youngest Earl? Because these are great positions of power, and I was wondering whether there was anybody who was very young in such a position, or whether in that day, as it is now, you had to be, 18, or in America 21 to be considered a man, to be considered worthy of such jobs, because of course there was it was a harder life, and therefore I imagined you had more responsibilities at a younger age.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And I will answer that question in a second, but
Okay.
I just want to digress slightly and come back to your original point, is that the reason I'm here too is I share your passion for bringing heritage to young people.
Mm-hmm.
Because going back to what I first said about my father inculcating the love of history into me,
Yes.
he said two things quite early on, and he repeated it when it was necessary till I really understood it. He said two things. He said, history is who you are, Howard. He was talking about your ancestors are your forebears, and your personality, character, looks come from those people. It is moulded by your ancestors.
Got you.
And that's another time. That's another one. That's another session on genealogy, perhaps. But he also said that history constantly repeats itself. In other words, people keep making exactly the same mistakes, and they still do to this day.
Yes.
And there's thousands of examples of where history has constantly repeated itself. People making the same mistakes, whatever the topic you're talking
Chopping
about.
hands off for stealing apples.
Yeah, it's still around. Still the same mistake.
Still the same.
Still the same mistake. So because I loved history from an early stage, and because when I do tours and when my fellow guides are doing tours in the castle, one of the common comments that we get back is, and this is not said in any sense of self-praise, it's said that people say, I wish you had been my history teacher.
Oh.
Because we all tell stories, all of
Yes.
us. This is what we do. We tell stories, and in the process get the history across. And history can be fascinating if you apply the storytelling technique to it. And that's my ambition as well, to get young people interested, because then they too can learn those two key lessons. History is who you are, and history constantly repeats itself. And if you learn that, you can avoid so many mistakes, because people keep making them. And the art is, to progress in life, is not to keep making the same mistake time after time after time.
And it's my belief, and I suppose it is postcards and podcasts, particular belief that by giving young people more responsibility, they'll be able to appreciate positions they might not necessarily have been put in before.
Correct.
Which brings me back to the question.
Yeah. So exposing history in a fun way, in an interesting way, without all those heavily laden dates and who came after this and who forget all that. I don't do that kind of history. But coming back to the question, well, I have a personal stake in this story, in actual fact, because when I did my genealogy, which took me 10 years to complete, I discovered that I had an Earl of Pembroke in my family tree, which is absolutely incredible. I could not believe it when I discovered it. His name was John Hastings, and he was the first Earl of another creation of Earls 600 years ago, and he was my first cousin, albeit 18 times removed, but he would have been a first cousin.
Wow.
Then there came his son, Now, his son was also called John Hastings. But this John Hastings, who would have been my later cousin, my earlier cousin, was, in fact, became the Earl at a very young age when his father died. And John, at the age of 17, the Earl of Pembroke, he was, in fact, jousting. He was fighting in tournaments.
So he was 17.
He was behaving as a full-blooded knight. And they learned their craft in two ways. The first way was to fight with wooden swords and spears and wooden clubs, and they'd beat 7 bells out of each other and learn in the process what it was to become a knight and develop their strength, their skill and their agility and their speed. Mm-hmm. I promise you, if you brought one of those old knights back and put him up against a fit young man with the armour on, the fit young man with the armour on without any experience would be on the floor in seconds. They were brilliant.
Sure.
Frightening, these great knights. And so John Hastings was indeed such a knight. But unfortunately, in one friendly tournament where you've developed it from wooden swords and shields to real weaponry, they fought with lances, as you know, the classic charging down the lists, trying to knock each other off their horses with lances.
Would we have had that in Pembroke Castle?
Yes, they did indeed. They had small tournaments in Pembroke Castle in the centre there. And one of the models in the castle shows a representation of a tournament there. The simple fact is that they had the tip of the spear or the lance blunted. It was not, you weren't trying to kill your opponent, you were just trying to get him off his horse without killing him. But accidents did happen, and unfortunately, he charged down the list, was hit by the lance of his opponent, which shattered, and the shattered end dropped down into his groin, into his upper thigh. And he died fairly quickly from his wounds.
Yes.
Whether he bled out or they held him. But it's not recorded, but he died almost immediately
Sure.
from a pure accident, practicing warfare, practicing his skills as a future knight.
Lesson to be learnt.
I can't remember his exact age. I think he was only a month or two old when he became the Earl, and he died. And as far as I can see, it was the shortest natural career of any of the Earls of Pembroke.
Wow. And that's your direct?
That's one of my direct ancestors.
Brilliant.
Amazing.
That is amazing. Thank you so much, Howard.
My pleasure to be here today. I've really enjoyed it. I look forward to coming and helping you out again with more podcasts. But I know you're out on the road soon.
Yes.
Meeting other people.
Yes.
So I wish you all the best in
Thanks
your
for
research
helping.
and talking to all these people.
Thank you, Howard.